Parashat VaYishlach, we have the famous episode where Yaakov Avinu wrestles with an adversary of some sort. And leaving aside the question of the identity of this adversary, the portion of the story about this wrestling match ends with a very curious connection between an injury that Yaakov receives and a mitzvah that we have in the Torah, seemingly as a result. Because at the end of this wrestling match, Yaakov is injured. It says, "VaYizrach lo hashemesh ka'asher avar et Penuel, vehu tzolea al Yericho. Al ken lo yochlu b'nai Yisrael et gid hanashe asher al kaf hayerech ad hayom hazeh ki nag'a bechaf yerech Yaakov begid hanashe." So as he passed over Penuel, which is the name of the place, the sun rose upon him and he limped upon his thigh. Therefore, the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the vein, which is in the hollow of the thigh to this day, because he touched the hollow of Yaakov's thigh in the sinew of the vein. Now, if the whole Torah worked this way, this might not be so remarkable. What I mean is that we have lots of mitzvot, and you could imagine a system of divine commands that somehow all were supposed to derive each in their way from some just so story in the life and times of some forefather or other. So this particular mitzvah that we don't eat the meat around the sciatic nerve of the kosher animal, it's called gid hanasheh. That comes from the fact that Yaakov was injured while wrestling in this place, and it seems rather arbitrary, but perhaps that's where we get mitzvot from in general, to remember things about the life and times of the avot and imahot. And so there could be some other point where Rivka Imenu ate meat with milk and had a stomachache, and that's why we don't eat meat with milk, right? You could keep on adding them. But that's not how the Torah seems to work. There's no other example where it's clear that there is, in a sense, an arbitrary detail of a narrative occurrence in the life of Yaakov or Yitzchak or Avraham, one of these founding characters of our nation, and then we just, without explanation, convert that into, now there is a command that applies to the nation as a whole, where we do this or we don't do that, simply because of this moment that we're trying somehow to remember, right? There's nothing obvious about why the fact that he was injured in this way should automatically lead us to be prohibited from eating the meat from the place where he was injured, but that's what the Torah says. And even so, even though the Torah doesn't have a lot of other examples where this kind of thing happens, I think we often read it and just kind of glide right by and say, okay, fine. I'm reading the story. Lots of the Torah's stories about the Avot and Imahot, and also lots of the Torah is mitzvot. And here's just an instance where I get both of them at the same time. I get a divine command, I also get a story. So what's the problem? But I think we could ask ourselves the question now, why is it that if this is the one instance basically where we do see a kind of a just so aspect to this, where it's sort of like, and that's how the elephant got its long trunk, except instead we're saying, and that's why we have this mitzvah. Why for this mitzvah of all mitzvot? What is the point of the prohibition of eating gid hanasheh, this piece of meat that you, when butchering a kosher animal, such as a sheep or a cow, have to extract and not provide among the different cuts of meat that you can produce that are kosher? Why would it be the case that this particular one would be connected with narrative in this way? I think there's actually perhaps a fairly straightforward answer, which is that this is trying to teach us a general lesson about all mitzvot, which is why we don't need many instances that work like this. The remarkable thing about the mitzvah of gid hanasheh is that we start with the idea that there are certain animals we're not allowed to eat, such as ostriches or rabbits, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's some animals that we are allowed to eat. In particular, let's talk about kosher mammals. They have to have split hooves. They have to chew their cuds. So we're talking about goats, sheep, cows. Not a whole lot of other kinds, but here and there, you could add other species to the list. And you might like to think, okay, that's where we've drawn the line now. There's a category of animals we can eat and one we can't eat. And now these ones that we can eat, they're permitted to us. So we should just be able to eat whatever we want from them. And then the mitzvah of Gida Nashek comes in and says, no, actually, within this kosher animal, there's a little piece of it that you're not allowed to eat. And so you can't simply come to the kosher animal and say, well, now that I've set this boundary around kosher animals and separated them from non-kosher animals, I'm in the domain of the permitted, and now I don't have to think anymore about what I can and can't do. I should just partake and enjoy and let's say, I don't want to say let go of any sense of restraint or abandonment, because obviously there still are rules about how you slaughter the animal, et cetera, but that there's some sense of this should all be permissible to me. And that's the thing that's being contradicted here, because this mitzvah is coming along and saying, actually, even when you're in a situation where, in a broad sense, you're doing something that is permitted, you shouldn't have the attitude, well, now that I've made sure that I'm permitted to do what I'm doing, that somehow I don't have to think further about treading carefully and doing this right and seeing whether, in fact, that there's some way that's still within the general framework of doing something that's permitted, that I might actually transgress. I might do the wrong thing. I might do what HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't want me to do. That starts to sound like a mitzvah that is trying to teach us a lesson more generally about all mitzvot, about all divine commands. So, yes, in this case, we say, okay, because Yaakov was wrestling and he got injured, that's why we have this mitzvah. But the mitzvah itself is a mitzvah that's about not tripping over some question of whether within the bounds of the law, it's actually possible to do something that's wicked, but mostly permitted or seemingly totally permitted. And that's a kind of caution about our general approach to mitzvot that we should be always showing. And isn't it interesting in that case that now you ask about the narrative aspect of what is happening there? Yaakov is engaged in this struggle with this adversary, but why is he wrestling with him for so long, until the sun shines, right? All night, and he won't let him go. What is he insisting on? He's saying, I won't let you go until you give me a bracha, right? Until you bless me. Now, even before we talk about what that reminds us of in the life of Yaakov, we can already see what this has to do to some degree with Gida Nasheh, with this forbidden cut of meat. That this is Yaakov struggling with the world, struggling with Hashem, struggling with whatever he has under his hands, trying to make sure that he gets out of it the bracha that he wants to get out of it. And that reminds us that we, in general, we come into the framework of what we're allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do. And we could approach it by kind of saying, okay, now that I have the rules of how I'm supposed to act, I'm going to try to get the best possible result from operating the system according to the rules that I can. And to some degree, that sounds like it should be okay, right? You know what's permitted, you know what's not permitted. You're going to avoid doing what's not permitted. And then within the domain of what's permitted, now it's kind of like, can you optimize still? Can you get a better deal? Can you get a better outcome because you apply your intelligence and your strength to making it work for you? And on the one hand, that is a characteristic of Yaakov that's so much a part of his personality that you figure to some degree that is part of the personality of all of Am Yisrael. And indeed, the name Am Yisrael contains this notion of wrestling, according to this passage. Sarita, it says, the adversary, the malach, whatever you want to call it, says to Yaakov when he gives him the name Yisrael, because you struggle, Sarita. But there's kind of a problem with that. At some level, there's this cautionary note here that's been contained in the mitzvah of the Gida Nasheh, because it's saying, okay, you're going to say what's permitted and what's not permitted, and then you're going to try to optimize within the space of what's permitted, get the best bracha that you can. But watch out for the possibility that actually there's a gray area. And actually, within the domain of what's permitted, you could end up finding a way of acting improperly, especially when you have the motivation to take what's under your hands and wrestle it or twist it into the shape that's best for you. Are you staying within the domain of what's permitted while you're doing that? Or are you at risk of being so motivated by the bracha that you're trying to get out of it all that maybe you're going to cross some line that even if it isn't there at the outset, that it should have been there all along? And perhaps the judgment of someone who was truly putting Hashem and service of Hashem first before the question of whether he gets the blessing that he wants would actually have steered clear of that or better appreciated that issue. I think you can, first of all, see this in the earlier narrative we have with Yaakov about, again, kind of struggling to get a blessing. This whole thing is happening later in his life, but earlier on, he was in a situation with his brother Esau where he got the blessing from Yitzchak instead of Esau. And from one perspective, actually, Yaakov wasn't doing anything improper. He goes to Yitzchak and he sort of lies, but he sort of tells the truth, right? Why? Because he already bought the birthright of Esau for the bowl of lentils. So he had the Bechorah, and he says, Ani Esau Bechorecha. So on the one hand, he's saying, Ani Esau, I'm your eldest son. And he uses the name of Esau, and in that sense, he's lying. But when he says, I am your firstborn son, in a legal sense, he's correct because he's purchased the right to say that from Esau already. So that moment where Yaakov is sort of stealing the bracha or getting the best blessing from the situation that he can, this might be one of these instances where he's gliding too close to the edge of the law. And the mitzvah of Gid Nashe is coming to remind us of that danger and of the expectation from HaKadosh Baruch Hu that we do better than that we don't just say, okay, this animal is permitted to me and now I'm going to consume whatever I want from it because I've already drawn all the lines that matter and the rest is just about me and me getting the most out of what's been permitted to me. That whenever we're in a permitted situation, we still should be asking, is there some way that I could turn this into a transgression because I'm so intent on getting what I want out of this? And maybe what we find is that actually we, in a sense, recognize ways in which we should show restraint, even if the law hasn't run ahead of us to set those boundaries in a clear way. I think the last point maybe to make along these lines is Torah, in a sense, comments on this whole issue with the one other appearance of the word nashe or noshe that we see elsewhere in Chumash. So Gid HaNashe is this anatomical description of a sort of piece of meat and nerve that ends up having implications for kosher butchery. But if we go elsewhere to Sefer Devarim, the word not nashe, but noshe appears in a very different context, in the context of a mitzvah, where we are talking about giving a loan to a poor person and then taking collateral for the loan. So it says, "Bahutz ta'amod va'aish asher," excuse me, "Bahutz ta'amod va'aish asher ata noshevo yotzi elecha et ha'avot ha'hutza. U'im ish anihu lo tishkav be'avoto. Hashev tashiv lo et ha'avot kevo hashemesh u'shachav be'shalmato u'varacheka u'lecha tehiyeh tzedakah lifnei Adonai Elohecha." So it says, you shall stand outside, and the man to whom you shall lend shall bring the pledge outside to you. And if the man is poor, you shall not sleep in his pledge, meaning keep it overnight. You shall deliver him back the pledge when the sun goes down, that he may sleep in it, in his own garment, and bless you, and it shall be tzedakah, righteousness to you before Hashem, your God. So, in an interesting way, this is kind of showing the opposite characteristic, right? You might have thought that the way that you should act in a situation where you're giving someone the loan is, okay, you give them the loan, they give you the collateral, and of course it's your right to hold on to the collateral. That's the point of collateral, right? If you're not holding on to it, then nothing is protecting you from being taken advantage of by someone who's going to run away and default on the loan. But the Torah is saying, no, if the person's poor and they don't have anything to sleep in, you can't take what they have to sleep in as collateral. And there's this acknowledgement that this is a kind of an act of tzedakah before Hashem, meaning that it's not totally fair. It's not exactly the same thing as what is owed to you is being given to you. It's more like you're giving up something that's owed to you as an extra act of tzedakah, but that's being commanded by the Torah. So at the end of the day, it's actually forbidden for you in this situation to insist on holding on to the collateral because the Torah is explicitly forbidding that. So whereas before we were talking about the kosher animal was totally permitted to you, and so you might have thought you could just eat the whole thing, that now within that there's some boundary that you have to be sensitive to, and you have to be aware that within the domain of the permitted, perhaps you should show some restraint and hang back. And here, it's commanding you to do almost the sort of inverse of that, where in this case, it's sort of something that it seems like is owed to you, but you're giving it up because you're thinking in terms of tzedakah. You're being commanded to incline, not to insist on what is owed to you entirely, but to within the domain of that entitlement, say, okay, I have to make a carve out of a bit of an exception and give it back. And so I think these two passages by the word Noshe and Noshe are being hinted at being related. And there's also this mention of overnight and the coming of the sun, which again references this moment where Yaakov is wrestling. So the Torah is giving us these two examples to give you the whole package, which again is that the divine command defines a framework for us of what's forbidden and permitted, but we're invited to tread carefully within the domain of the permitted, understanding that this is not a case where we should somehow now think that as long as we stay clear of certain lines, we can just optimize for our own sake and forget Hashem, because there always is some way of realizing another level of caution and consideration for other people, or self-restraint and self-limitation that could bring us closer to Hashem and help us keep him as the highest priority. And then we see also an example of how that plays out in our relationships with other people, where it's especially important for us to show that caution because it ultimately amounts to sensitivity to the needs of others that will prevent us from insisting on what is fully our due, seemingly, according to a simpler conception of the law. And then that ultimately, that sensitivity is the Torah's proof text for the whole idea of tzedakah, the whole idea of righteous generosity to our fellow member of Am Yisrael. Kol tuv.